Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
The rain hit the roof of the funeral home so hard it sounded like someone was throwing handfuls of gravel onto the shingles, a fitting backdrop to a ceremony that felt less like a mourning and more like a performance, complete with crocodile tears and trembling chins that nobody really meant. I sat 3 rows from the front, squeezed between my father's new wife, Sandy, who wore way too much perfume for a place meant for breathing heavy grief, and my cousin Drew, who spent more time checking his phone than looking at the casket where Grandma lay still and cold. They all came, of course, because when someone like Margaret Jane Whitmore died, even the estranged and opportunistic showed up, sniffing around like rats after cheese left out on a counter. I sat still, not crying, not moving much at all, just watching the show unfold with the kind of grim fascination that usually only comes from car wrecks or bad reality TV. Grandma always said funerals weren't for the dead anyway. They were for the living to dress up their guilt in black clothes and sit awkwardly on folding chairs, pretending the right words would patch over the years they ignored her calls or left her birthday cards unsigned. I glanced around the room and saw Uncle Rick, who hadn't visited her once in the nursing home, wiping fake tears with a napkin from his pocket. I caught Aunt Linda, who used to complain about how boring Grandma was, dabbing at her mascara with a tissue that left little flecks of white on her face like sad confetti. My sister Jessica sat right at the front, of course, practically touching the casket, dabbing at her eyes with a neatly folded handkerchief, like she was starring in some melodramatic soap opera. Jessica always did know how to work a crowd. With her perfect blonde hair pinned up into some complicated braid and her simple black dress that probably cost more than my rent, she looked like a grieving angel, the kind of woman who made strangers whisper about how deeply she must have loved her grandmother. What none of them knew or cared to notice was that Jessica's grief was about as real as a $3 bill. She loved the idea of Grandma, sure, the warm, generous woman who baked pies and handed out birthday checks, but the real, stubborn, messy Grandma who held grudges and spoke her mind without caring if it hurt your feelings? Jessica barely tolerated her. I picked at the hem of my black skirt, an old thing I had dug out of my closet last night, when I realized I didn't even own anything decent enough for a funeral anymore. It still smelled faintly like the cedar chest where I kept my high school memories. For a second, I thought about leaving, about walking right out those double doors and never looking back, but something anchored me there, something heavier than guilt and older than anger. I had come for Grandma, even if most of the others were just there to see what she had left behind. The priest, a soft-spoken man with a paunchy belly and wire-rimmed glasses, droned on about eternal life and the blessed hope of resurrection, words that fell flat in the heavy, muggy air of that old funeral home. I watched Jessica out of the corner of my eye. Her shoulders shook gently in that picture-perfect way, like a professional mourner hired by a wealthy family. I wondered if she had practiced in the mirror that morning, just to make sure the tears fell on cue. When the eulogy ended and the priest closed his little black book, there was an awkward pause, the kind of silence that made you aware of every cough, every rustle of clothing, every sniffle that might have been real or fake. That's when Jessica rose to her feet, slow and deliberate, like royalty taking the throne. Her heels clicked sharply against the tile as she moved towards the little podium standing just to the left of Grandma's closed casket. I felt my stomach twist, tight and sour, because I knew Jessica well enough to recognize that gleam in her eye. She was about to take the stage, and in typical Jessica fashion, it was not going to be about Grandma at all. It was going to be about Jessica, how much she was loved, how deeply she was trusted, how special she was compared to everyone else. I could already hear the fake sincerity dripping from her voice, the carefully rehearsed tremors of grief, the dramatic pauses for effect. I sat back in my seat, crossing my arms tight across my chest, and watched as she grabbed the microphone like she owned the place. This was her moment, the beginning of the performance she had probably been imagining for weeks, maybe months, ever since Grandma's health started to fail. I leaned forward just slightly, sensing the shift in the room, the way people perked up like they knew something juicy was coming. Jessica placed one manicured hand against her heart, tilted her chin upward at just the right angle, and with a tiny sob, she said, "I just want to say, from the bottom of my heart, that I was always Grandma's favorite." She told me everything. The words floated through the thick, humid air like a spark in dry grass, and I could almost hear the collective intake of breath around the room. Some people smiled, others glanced around awkwardly. But me? I just sat there, still as stone, because unlike everyone else, I knew something that Jessica didn't. Something that was about to turn this little show of hers into a goddamn Greek tragedy. And it was coming faster than she could imagine. Jessica stood at the podium like she was accepting an award, dabbing delicately at her already dry eyes, letting just enough of a shaky breath escape her lips to sell the image of the dutiful, heartbroken granddaughter. She adjusted the microphone with an exaggerated sigh, sending a high-pitched screech through the funeral home's dusty old speakers that made a few people wince and shift uncomfortably in their seats. It was the kind of attention-grabbing move she had perfected over the years, make just enough noise that everyone's eyes snapped back to her, just in case a few brave souls had dared to look away for even a second. She placed both hands flat against the podium as if steadying herself against the terrible weight of her grief, and in a voice thick with false emotion, she began, "I just want to thank everyone for coming today to honor the beautiful soul of my grandmother, Margaret Jane Whitmore, the woman who taught me everything I know about kindness, patience, and unconditional love." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from snorting out loud, because if there was one thing Jessica Whitmore was not, it was patient. She had been the type to scream bloody murder if her birthday presents were 5 minutes late or if someone else dared to wear the same dress she had picked for a high school dance. But nobody in that room seemed to remember the screaming matches or the tantrums or the way she used to roll her eyes and call Grandma Old Bat behind her back. All they saw was a blonde angel bathed in the soft glow of grief, painting herself as the devoted favorite. Jessica smiled sweetly and continued, "Grandma and I had a bond that no one else could understand. She told me everything, every secret, every fear, every dream. I knew her better than anyone in this room ever could." She paused just long enough to let the weight of her words sink in, and I could feel dozens of heads turning to look at her with admiration, sympathy, and, God help me, a little envy too. I stared at my hands, knotted together so tightly in my lap that my knuckles turned white. She went on, spinning her little fairy tale, carefully stitching half-truths into a quilt, so convincing that even I, who knew better, almost believed her for a moment. She talked about how she would spend weekends baking with Grandma, true, but conveniently leaving out that she spent most of that time on her phone, how she would read to her in the evenings, neglecting to mention that she would fall asleep halfway through, how she would sit for hours just listening to Grandma's stories, when really, she nodded absently while texting her friends about how bored she was. I sat there listening, the edges of my vision tinged with red, but I stayed quiet. I thought about standing up, thought about marching right to the front and yanking that microphone out of her manicured hands, but something told me to wait. Patience, after all, was a virtue Grandma had always said I had in spades. Jessica's voice dropped into a low, trembling register, the kind that made grown men tear up and women clasp their hands over their hearts. "Grandma always said I was her favorite," she whispered. "She told me, again and again, that she could always count on me." I shifted uncomfortably in my seat and, without thinking, muttered under my breath, "Grandma passed away at 92. Or maybe it was 82. Numbers were never my strong suit." The words slipped out too loud, loud enough that Sandy, my father's wife, turned her head and gave me a pointed look, her eyebrows practically climbing into her hairline. I clamped my mouth shut, feeling my cheeks flush, and prayed no one else had caught my little gaffe. Later, I would realize that mistake would catch plenty of attention, not for what it said about Grandma, but for what it said about me. People loved pointing out mistakes, even tiny ones, especially when the speaker was already invisible to them in the first place. Jessica shot me a quick glare, the kind that could strip paint off a wall, before smoothing her features back into that nauseating mask of grief. She picked up where she left off, undeterred, talking about how Grandma had wanted her to have the family home, how they had whispered about it late at night like co-conspirators in some grand sentimental scheme. "And I promise," Jessica said, her voice thick with fake emotion, "I will honor her wishes. I will keep her home in our family, preserve her memories, and make sure that her spirit lives on through me." I knew she was lying through her perfect white teeth. If Jessica got her hands on that house, it would be sold faster than you could say real estate agent, the profits blown on designer handbags and luxury vacations before the ink on the sale papers was even dry. She didn't want to honor Grandma's memory. She wanted to profit from it. The room was dead silent when Jessica finished, except for the faint sniffling of a few distant cousins and the low hum of the ancient air conditioning struggling to keep up with the sticky Florida heat. Jessica stepped back from the podium, head bowed humbly, and made her way back to her seat, casting me a triumphant smirk as she passed, like a schoolyard bully who had just stolen someone's lunch money and gotten away with it. I sat perfectly still, forcing myself to breathe evenly, feeling the weight of 1,000 angry words pressing against the inside of my chest. But I said nothing. I waited, because I knew something Jessica didn't. Just as the silence began to stretch into something awkward and uncertain, there was a low, polite cough from the left side of the room. Every head turned. There, standing up from the shadowy corner where he had been sitting all along, was Mr. Hargrove, Grandma's longtime attorney. His dark gray suit looked almost black in the dim light, and he held a thick manila envelope tucked under one arm. He cleared his throat again, this time louder, and the sound sliced through the tension like a sharp knife through overripe fruit. The reading of the will, the moment Jessica thought would seal her victory, was about to begin. And she had no idea what was coming for her. Mr. Hargrove moved with the kind of slow, deliberate care that only a man who had seen far too many greedy families unravel could manage, pulling a thick, slightly worn folder from the manila envelope and adjusting his glasses at the end of his nose before clearing his throat once again. The room shifted collectively, like a herd sensing a storm brewing on the horizon, as every cousin, uncle, aunt, and long-lost friend sat up, just a little straighter, their ears practically stretching toward him as if proximity alone could sway the contents of the will in their favor. Jessica folded her hands neatly in her lap, the serene little smile frozen on her face, like she already knew what was coming, her back rod straight, her breathing calm and measured, as if she was prepared to gracefully accept the kingdom she believed was already hers. For a split second, I wondered if she truly thought she deserved it. If all the years of pretense and carefully curated moments of fake affection had built up such a fortress of delusion around her that she genuinely expected Grandma to reward her for simply showing up when it was convenient. Mr. Hargrove adjusted his tie, glanced around the room with a patience that bordered on pity, and began to read, his voice flat and professional, slicing through the tension like a razor. "To my beloved granddaughter Jessica Whitmore," he started, and Jessica's entire face lit up in a way that made me want to throw up into my purse. "I leave my antique music box, a treasured possession from my own mother, as a reminder that appearances are not always what they seem." The silence that followed was so profound that even the battered ceiling fans above us seemed to slow to a crawl, as if the very air was too stunned to move. Jessica's smile faltered, twitched, and then collapsed altogether, leaving behind a blank, confused expression that was somehow even more satisfying than any loud wail or dramatic collapse could have been. I could almost hear the gears grinding in her head, trying to process the words, trying to find a way to spin this obvious slap in the face into something she could still claim as a victory. Mr. Hargrove, unbothered by the collective confusion, continued without missing a beat. To my granddaughter Elaine Whitmore, my name, spoken aloud for what felt like the first time in years without a sigh or an eye roll attached, I leave the remainder of my estate, including my home, all furnishings, my personal jewelry collection, and the contents of my savings account at First Citizens Bank. A low murmur swept through the room like the first gust of wind before a hurricane. Chairs creaked, shoes shuffled, and someone actually gasped out loud. An honest-to-God soap opera gasp that would have been funny if my heart wasn't hammering so loud I could barely hear it. I sat there frozen, my hands gripping the edge of my seat so tightly that I felt the blood drain from my fingers, unsure if I had actually heard the words correctly or if my desperate longing for justice had conjured them out of thin air. Jessica's head snapped toward me so fast that I half expected to hear something crack, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, her eyes wide with the kind of naked betrayal that would have been tragic if it wasn't so richly deserved. I stared back at her, too stunned to even attempt to smile, too aware that gloating would only cheapen this perfect, impossible moment that had fallen into my lap like a gift wrapped in righteous fury. As Mr. Hargrove droned on, listing off the smaller bequests to various charities and old friends, my mind drifted backward, unspooling memory after memory of all the times Jessica had made it perfectly clear what she thought of me. I remembered being 13 years old and overhearing her laughing with her friends about how Elaine's only talent is being invisible. I remembered her rolling her eyes during family dinners when I tried to tell Grandma about my college plans, muttering just loud enough for me to hear, "Nobody cares about your little dreams, Elaine." I remembered her snatching Grandma's locket from my hands one Christmas, claiming it was meant for her because only special girls got special things. Each memory stacked neatly atop the last, forming a tower of resentment so tall and so precarious that it was a wonder it hadn't toppled sooner. But now, sitting in that uncomfortable plastic chair in that suffocating funeral home, I realized that it didn't need to topple. It had been replaced, erased by the simple, irrefutable truth written in Grandma's careful handwriting, witnessed and notarized and sealed inside that thick folder Mr. Hargrove now held like a sword cutting through all of Jessica's lies. I watched as she sat stiffly in her chair, her hands clenched into tight, shaking fists in her lap, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. I knew she was fighting the urge to stand up and scream, to demand a recount, a redo, a world in which her lies had paid off the way she thought they always would. Instead, she sat there simmering because even Jessica understood that throwing a tantrum at a funeral was a bridge too far, even for her. At least for now. Mr. Hargrove closed the folder with a soft thud, the final punctuation mark on a day that none of us would ever forget, and tucked it neatly back into his briefcase. The room shifted again, people murmuring polite condolences to one another, sneaking glances at me, their faces a complicated tangle of envy, curiosity, and thinly veiled judgment. And then, just as I thought it was over, that I could finally stand and leave and breathe for the first time all day, Mr. Hargrove cleared his throat once more and reached into the envelope, pulling out a small, elaborately carved music box. He held it up for the room to see, its dark wood gleaming under the harsh, fluorescent lights, its delicate inlays forming swirling patterns that seemed almost to move when you looked at them too long. This, he said, his voice quieter now, almost reverent, was Mrs. Whitmore's most cherished possession. She wanted it passed to Jessica with one simple instruction: do not open it until you are ready to hear the truth. The room froze again, a different kind of silence this time, heavier, charged with something I couldn't quite name. Jessica's hand twitched toward the box, but stopped short, as if afraid it might bite her. And sitting there, watching her hesitate for the first time in her life, I realized with a chill that the real inheritance, the real secret, hadn't even been touched yet. The ride home from the funeral was the kind of quiet that felt deafening, the kind that pressed against your eardrums until you swore you could hear your own heartbeat thudding in the hollow space between your ears. I drove with both hands clenched so tightly on the steering wheel that my knuckles ached, not trusting myself to say a word even to the empty car, afraid that if I spoke, all the swirling, tangled emotions inside me would come spilling out in one long, ugly scream. The music box sat on the passenger seat, small and unassuming, its polished wood gleaming every time the setting sun caught it through the cracked windshield, almost like it was daring me to look at it, to touch it, to open it, and see what waited inside. For a long time after I pulled into the driveway of what was now, unbelievably, my house, I just sat there in the car, staring at the front door and trying to reconcile the life I had always known with the one that had been handed to me like some kind of impossible gift. This house had been the backdrop to every important memory I owned, the site of every Christmas morning and Easter egg hunt and lazy Sunday afternoon filled with the smell of pot roast and the sound of old country music playing from the kitchen radio. And now it was mine, all mine, thanks to a woman who had seen more than any of us ever realized. The box was heavier than it looked when I finally picked it up, cradling it carefully against my chest like something alive and fragile. The key was already in the latch, a tiny brass thing shaped like a heart, and for a long moment, I just ran my thumb back and forth over it, feeling the cool metal against my skin and wondering if I really wanted to know whatever truth Grandma had hidden inside. Some part of me, the part that still flinched whenever Jessica raised her voice, the part that had learned to survive by expecting the worst, whispered that maybe it was better not to know. That maybe some secrets were better left buried alongside the people who kept them. But another part of me, the part that had sat silently through years of being overlooked, underestimated, and forgotten, knew that I had earned whatever answers Grandma had left behind. So, with a deep breath that shook in my chest, I turned the key and opened the lid. At first, there was nothing inside except the expected velvet lining, deep red and still plush despite the years. I tilted the box slightly, and a small envelope slid out from a hidden compartment at the bottom, fluttering into my lap like a leaf torn free from a tree. My name was written on the front in Grandma's familiar, looping handwriting, and just seeing it was enough to make my throat close up and my eyes burn with tears I had managed to hold back all day. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers, unfolding the letter inside with the same care I might have used for an ancient artifact, terrified that it might crumble into dust if I breathed too hard. The paper was thick and creamy, the ink slightly faded but still legible, every word written with the deliberate, steady hand of a woman who had never rushed anything in her life. "My dearest Elaine," it began, and just those 3 words undid me, sending a hot tear rolling down my cheek before I could stop it. I wiped it away angrily, not wanting to miss a single word. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the world feels a little colder, a little quieter than it did before. I am sorry for that, but I am not sorry for the choices I made. You deserve to know why. I leaned back against the headrest, the leather warm against my spine, and let her voice carry me away. I have watched you, my sweet girl, for your whole life, and I have seen the strength you do not even realize you have. I saw it when you gave your toys away to the neighborhood kids without being asked. I saw it when you comforted your mother after your father left, even though you were just a child yourself. I saw it every time you stayed behind to help me clean up when everyone else had better places to be. My chest ached with a painful kind of pride, the kind that made you want to laugh and cry and punch a wall all at once. I had never thought anyone noticed those things. I had certainly never thought Grandma did. As for Jessica, the letter continued, and here the writing grew a little shakier, as if the emotions behind the words had made even Grandma's steady hand falter. "I love her as I love all my family, but love does not make a person blind. I know about the lies she told, the money she borrowed and never repaid, the way she smiled in my face and rolled her eyes the moment my back was turned. I forgave her because that is what love demands, but I could not reward her." I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the full weight of those words settle over me like a blanket, warm but suffocating. Part of me wanted to feel victorious, vindicated, but mostly I just felt sad for all the wasted chances, all the broken bonds that no amount of money or jewelry or family heirlooms could ever fix. You, Grandma wrote, never asked for anything, never expected anything. And that is why I give you everything. Because you will not waste it. Because you will honor it, and maybe, in doing so, you will heal some of the cracks this family has left behind. I let the letter fall into my lap, staring blankly out the windshield at the darkening sky, feeling something crack open inside me, something that was equal parts gratitude, sorrow, and fear. I did not know if I could live up to the faith Grandma had placed in me, but I knew I had to try. I owed her that much. Before I could fully collect my swirling thoughts, my phone buzzed angrily in my pocket, a shrill sound that shattered the fragile piece like a rock through glass. I pulled it out with a sigh, already knowing who it would be before I even looked at the screen. Jessica. I stared at her name blinking on the display for a long moment before finally swiping to answer, bracing myself for the inevitable. You need to give me the house, Jessica said immediately, her voice sharp and desperate, all pretense of grief and dignity gone. Grandma wanted me to have it. She must have gotten confused. She was old, Elaine. You know that. You can't seriously think she meant to leave it to you. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the seat, feeling a slow, simmering anger rise up in my chest, steady and certain. Jessica had not even opened the music box yet, had not even read the truth waiting inside, and already she was trying to steal what had never belonged to her in the first place. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, Jessica's voice dropped to a low, venomous hiss. If you don't give me the house, she said, it'll make your life a living hell. And just like that, I knew this fight was only just beginning. The idea for the housewarming party came to me late one night, as I sat alone in the kitchen that had once smelled like Grandma's cinnamon bread and now just smelled like fresh paint and wood polish. I knew it was petty, childish even, but I also knew deep in my bones that it was exactly what needed to happen, a line in the sand that could not be erased or smudged out no matter how much Jessica clawed at it. I made a long list of people to invite: cousins, old family friends, a few of Grandma's neighbors who still remembered me from when I was small, and I made damn sure that Jessica Whitmore's name never even came close to that paper. The invitations went out the old-fashioned way, handwritten on thick cream cardstock that made it clear this was not some casual pizza and solo cup affair, but a real event, something formal and full of meaning. The words I chose were careful, deliberate, leaving just enough room for gossip to take root and grow like wild vines before anyone even stepped through the front door. By the time the evening of the party arrived, the house was bursting with bodies and soft laughter, the air thick with the smell of baked ham and fresh coffee, the kind of smells that said family even if the faces they belonged to barely knew how to say more than a few polite sentences to each other anymore. I wore one of Grandma's old brooches pinned to my dress, a small silver rose that had always caught the light in the most flattering ways, and every time someone complimented it, I smiled and said thank you without mentioning that Jessica had once tried to pawn it during a particularly bad stretch of college debt she had managed to rack up in her endless pursuit of being admired. The first sign of trouble came about an hour into the evening, right when the conversation was hitting that easy lull where people started to think about second cups of coffee or whether they could politely sneak away without drawing attention. The front door slammed so hard against the frame that a framed photo of Grandma and me at my high school graduation rattled on the wall. Every head in the room turned as Jessica stormed in like a thundercloud wrapped in designer silk, her cheeks flushed with anger and her eyes flashing that particular shade of green that only ever appeared when she was truly, irredeemably furious. Well, she announced, her voice high and brittle, cutting through the hum of conversation like a knife. Isn't this just charming? My own grandmother's house turned into a goddamn carnival, and no one even bothered to invite me. The room fell into an awkward silence so deep you could practically hear the ice cubes melting in the punch bowl. I set down my glass carefully on the nearest table, wiped my hands on my skirt, and stepped forward, feeling the heavy, familiar weight of 1,000 unsaid things pressing against my ribs. "You're right," I said calmly, feeling the eyes of every guest burning into my skin. "You weren't invited. Because tonight is for the people Grandma trusted. The people she chose." Jessica let out a sharp, humorless laugh, the kind that bounced off the high ceilings and made more than a few people flinch. She marched right up to me, standing so close I could smell the sharp bite of the perfume she always wore when she wanted to seem powerful. "You think a piece of paper and a jewelry box make you better than me?" she hissed under her breath, low enough that only I could hear it. "You think any of these people actually give a damn about you?" I could have argued, could have listed every slight, every betrayal, every wound she had ever inflicted with that pretty mouth and sharper tongue. Instead, I reached into my pocket, pulled out the letter, the first letter, and held it up high for everyone to see. "I think," I said slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle deep into the floorboards, "that Grandma knew exactly who we both were. And I think she left me something you'll never understand." I did not read the whole letter aloud. That was never the plan. I read just enough, just a few lines about love given without expectations, about trust earned and not demanded, about seeing the truth behind the masks people wore to survive. The room shifted around me, the atmosphere turning electric as people started to put the pieces together, seeing the cracks in Jessica's perfect porcelain facade. Jessica stood there trembling, her fists clenched at her sides, her mouth opening and closing without sound. For one delicious, perfect moment, she was speechless, undone not by cruelty or manipulation, but by the simple, brutal weight of the truth. But even as I tucked the letter carefully back into my pocket and turned away from her, feeling the sting of tears I refused to let fall, something about the weight of the music box still tugged at my mind. Later, after the guests had gone home and the house was quiet except for the soft ticking of Grandma's old mantel clock, I sat down in the living room with the music box in my lap. The secret compartment was not easy to find. It took nearly an hour of careful prying, tilting, and inspecting every tiny seam before I heard the faint click of a hidden latch. Inside, wrapped in brittle yellowed paper, was a second letter, one not addressed to me, but to whoever found it. My hands shook as I unfolded it, and the first few lines made my stomach twist into knots. "I made mistakes," Grandma had written in a hand much shakier than the first letter. "I loved blindly, trusted too easily, and hurt people without meaning to. I did not always choose the right way to fix what I had broken." As I read further, the pit in my stomach grew. Grandma spoke of secret debts she had paid to cover for family members' mistakes, lies she had told to keep the peace, silent sacrifices she had made that had only ended up festering into resentment. It became clear that while she had loved deeply, she had also manipulated situations, chosen favorites, and used guilt as a weapon just as deftly as Jessica had used charm. When I finally folded the second letter and tucked it away, I felt no triumph, no gloating satisfaction. Just a heavy, aching sadness that filled every corner of the house like fog. Grandma had left me the house, the heirlooms, the jewelry, and the truth, but she had also left me the burden of knowing that none of us, not even the ones we love most, are ever entirely innocent. As I sat there in the deepening shadows, the music box still warm in my hands, I wondered if I had won anything at all, or if I had just inherited the biggest mess of all.